Observing Yom Kippur anywhere is a special experience. There's a flow to the day, a progression that begins at sundown with the majesty of Kol Nidre. It continues through a day of reflection and contemplation before finally peaking in those last moments with the beautiful words of Ne'ilah and that piercing sound of the shofar. But there's something particularly special about Yom Kippur in Israel. It is a day when the whole country virtually comes to a stop. TV and radio broadcasts go off the air, airspace over the country is closed, and just about all traffic in the streets is from people walking or on bicycles. You hear the music of the liturgy everywhere you go, and it is a day when you truly feel connected to something greater than yourself. I'm blessed that I was able to experience that twice, once as a student in high school, and then again while in rabbinical school. And each of those experiences still stay with me on every Yom Kippur. But it was amidst that backdrop of what many consider to be the holiest day of the year that Israel experienced one of the darkest days of its history. 50 years ago today, on Yom Kippur afternoon in 1973, air raid sirens began sounding across Israel. Initially, people did not know what was happening. It took a few minutes for radio broadcasts to get on the air saying that the sirens were real and instructing people to head for shelters. An hour later, the broadcast announced Egypt and Syria have attacked. Partial mobilization of reserve troops has been ordered. Just after 5 p.m., Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir told the country that Egypt and Syria had opened fire, beginning what we know today as the Yom Kippur War. I'm sure many of you remember that Yom Kippur, and I know that some of you were right here in this sanctuary when you heard that news. Later reports showed that within the first few minutes of the war, 240 Egyptian fighter jets, along with 2,000 soldiers, crossed the Suez Canal to attack Israeli positions in Sinai. And in the north, 600 Syrian tanks began driving through the Golan Heights, with only 57 Israeli tanks standing in their way. Those first few days of the Yom Kippur War were among the darkest in all of Israel's history, especially considering the years leading up to it. After Israel survived the Six-Day War in 1967, the country was filled with a sense of endless optimism. The state was growing, Jerusalem was united, the Israeli army was strong. What could possibly go wrong? That overconfidence, though, led many leaders in Israel's government and military to ignore warning signs that the Yom Kippur attack was imminent. As a result, not only were 2,600 Israeli soldiers killed in action, but there was a true sense of fear during those first few days of the war that Israel would lose, meaning its destruction. Thankfully, that did not come to pass, as over the 2.5 weeks of the war, Israel managed to fight back and defend itself, eventually maintaining the borders in place when the war began. But while the status quo was held in terms of territory, the sense of confidence and optimism was gone. Following the war, a protest movement began to demand accountability, demanding to know how Israel was caught by surprise. The protests eventually reached the Israeli Supreme Court, where the court's president, Shimon Agranat, led a commission to investigate the lead-up to the war. This commission of inquiry eventually found many failings in military leadership and recommended several changes. Controversially, the commission did not point to any specific government failures, but the political fallout was already too great, and less than a year after the war ended, Golda Meir resigned her position as prime minister. While Israel's physical survival isn't threatened in the same way it was in 1973, some consider the atmosphere that is present today to be the darkest Israel has experienced since the Yom Kippur War. 50 years ago, a mass movement reached the Supreme Court protesting the government. Today, a mass movement protests the government for what it plans to do to the Supreme Court. In early January, shortly after the swearing in to the new government under Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, Minister of Justice Yariv Levin and Chair of the Knesset's Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee, Simcha Rothman, announced their plans for so-called judicial reform. One of the major initiatives of their plan would limit the Supreme Court's ability to declare legislation of the government unconstitutional. In short, the Knesset would be able to overrule such Supreme Court decisions by a majority vote. Without a formal constitution, similar to the one that we have here, Israel's Supreme Court generally functions as the system of checks and balances on the government itself. But this judicial reform proposal would remove that safeguard, allowing even the smallest of majority governments to proceed at will. For many in Israel and around the world, this severely threatened the democratic nature of Israel's government. Almost immediately, grassroots protests against this reform began to spread across Israel, with as many as 200,000 people coming together at weekly demonstrations in Tel Aviv. Protests have now continued for nearly 40 weeks, including in New York last week, as Netanyahu delivered his remarks to the United Nations. Protests in Israel are nothing new. Seemingly every summer, there's a new wave for any number of important causes: affordable housing and cost of living, women's rights, peace with the Palestinians. But this time, the protests seem to have reached a new level, capturing the passion and energy of so many people and bringing the rhetoric and crisis to a new level. Part of what has been so fascinating about these demonstrations is the way they have come from a place of love for their country and the full-hearted embrace of Zionism. In all the pictures of these mass protests, I'm sure you have seen many of them online, the crowds of people are mixed among a sea of Israeli flags, blue and white everywhere. And those demonstrations always include the singing of Hatikvah. They are not just demonstrations against judicial reform, but they are demonstrations for Zionism, for Israel. That is why they have captured the spirit of such a wide cross-section of Israelis, from young and old, secular to religious Zionists, and even many former military and intelligence leaders proudly joined together to wave the flag and fight for Israel as it ought to be. Which is also why it has been so disheartening to see the government barely hesitate in its efforts, passing the first steps of their plan in July while ignoring the cries that came from a majority of their country. With crowds gathered outside to bewail these initial steps towards the supposed death of democracy, government ministers took selfies on the Knesset floor in celebration of their accomplishment. This issue, more than any other, has led many American Jews to reconsider their support and commitment to Israel and its government. Some synagogues have stopped reciting the prayer for Israel, and some made the active choice not to support Israel Bonds and other Israel organizations this year. But neither of those is true for our community. We recited the prayer for Israel a few minutes ago, and the Israeli Bonds pledge cards are out in the lobby. While we do question the government's initiative and proudly join in the calls for democratic checks and balances, the protests and controversy that are taking place today are part of the messiness that completes the picture of Israel as we know it. There is a great deal to be concerned about and to advocate for, but that all must come from a place of love and connection to the country that is so important to us. I was fortunate to join over 40 members of our community who traveled to Israel as part of Federation's Centennial Mission in July. and I know of many more members of our community who were in Israel this summer as well, as part of other group or family trips, including several students. In fact, we'll hear from many of those students who were in Israel during Friday night services this week. During our trip, I took some time to myself on Shabbat afternoon and wandered around the area near our hotel. One of my favorite spots in Jerusalem is Yamin Moshe. Located right next to the Montefiore windmill, the area encompasses the first neighborhoods built outside the walls of the old city. And so Yamin Moshe has some of the best views and overlooks of Old Jerusalem. So I spent some time there just soaking in the sights and atmosphere. If you've ever seen the walls of the old city or the Kotel, you know that the bricks towards the bottom are much bigger, and then they get smaller as you look higher up. Intuitively, this makes sense. The large blocks at the bottom make up the foundation. Everything rests on those blocks, the weight of all that comes on top of it. Without a strong foundation, the walls would crumble. Yet at the same time, those smaller blocks at the top, they complete the picture. They may not be as pretty, as impressive, or as uniform as the blocks of the foundation, but without the blocks at the top of the picture, it's just not the same. Our connection to Israel is one of those large blocks. It's rooted, along with our historical connections and our spiritual yearnings, and knowing that Israel is a homeland for all the Jewish people. Yet, if that is all Israel is, we're missing those blocks at the top, the ones that don't quite fit, that aren't always even, which don't look or feel nearly as impressive as the ones at the foundation, but the ones that we still need to see when we look at Israel. We need to see the people who are there now, not just the stones and the artifacts, but the living, breathing people with all of their strengths as well as their faults. After sitting in Yamin Moshe for a while, I walked just down the hill to the Tachana Rishonah, literally meaning the first station. The Tachana is the old train station that brought rail travel to Jerusalem in 1892. After falling out of use and sitting vacant for a long time, the station was rebuilt in recent years as a major center for culture, entertainment, and dining. It hosts events throughout the year, including a popular musical Kabbalat Shabbat service on Friday afternoons. That day, on an ordinary afternoon in July with nothing special on the calendar, the station was alive. People of all backgrounds, out and about, old and young, religious and secular, Jews and Arabs, all together, enjoying this vibrant part of the city. On a Shabbat afternoon, no less, when so many other areas are quiet and shut down, here was a beautiful, lively picture of what modern Israel is and ought to be. The walls of Jerusalem are beautiful, and I could stare at them for hours. They are part of the foundations of my connection to Israel. But they aren't alive in the same way that scene of the first station was. The people there, along with all their views and perspectives, complete the picture, just as the bricks towards the top of those walls. These two scenes of Jerusalem reminded me of a beautiful poem by Yehuda Amichai, one of the first modern Israeli poets. Entitled Tayarim, Tourists, Amichai wrote about his experience watching so many tourists come visit his home where he lived his day-to-day life. Once I sat on the steps of a gate by David's Tower. I placed my two heavy baskets at my side. A group of tourists was standing around their guide, and I became their target marker. You see that man with the baskets? Just to the right of his head, there's an arch from the Roman period, just right of his head. But he's moving. He's moving. Amarti belibi, hageulah tavo, rak im yagidu lahem, atem ro'im sham et hakeshet min hatkufa haromit, lo chashuv, aval liyada, k'tzat smola ulamata mimena, Yoshev Adam shekana perot v'irakot leveto. I said to myself, redemption will come only if their guide tells them, you see that arch from the Roman period? It's not important. But next to it, to the left and down a bit, there sits a man who bought fruits and vegetables for his family. As much as we all love to see and visit the historical sites of Israel, we also need to see the people for all that they are. The history, the ancient roots are part of the bedrock, the foundations of our connection to Israel today. But we need those blocks at the top too, the blocks of a people who are passionate, lively, diverse, and invested in the future of Israel and in the future of Judaism. It's the people of Israel today who are leading it through these challenges. People who have been protesting tirelessly for months, pushing their government to maintain a system of checks and balances. The protesters may be passionately against the government, but they are more passionately in favor of their country. A country that still creates so many moments to appreciate, even through its darkest days. Protests against the government are usually scheduled on Saturday nights after Shabbat. Rallies in support tend to be on Thursdays. In one neighborhood's WhatsApp chat group, a supporter of the government was planning to attend a rally on a Thursday, so he posted that he needed to borrow someone's flag. A neighbor responded, "Sure, of course you can take my flag. I just need it back for my protest on Saturday." In another moment, a major protest against the reforms had just ended, and a rally supporting it was about to begin. At the train station nearby, videos showed all the protesters against the government going down the escalators on their way home. But right across from them were people heading up on their way to the counter-protest. People with such different beliefs and visions, literally heading in opposite directions, but still reached across. They reached between the escalators to share so many handshakes, hugs, and greetings between friends. On the final day of our trip to this summer, we visited what seemed like the center of everything, the Supreme Court building itself. There was no rally or protest there, nothing political of any sort, just an architectural and artistic tour of the building. In each courtroom, the judges sit at the front on a raised platform. And in front of them is a built-in table for the lawyers arguing each case. But by design, that table has a curved edge stretching from one side of the room to the other, so that while the lawyers sit on opposite sides, they still sit at the same table. They argue against each other, but literally share common ground. These are the people who live in Israel today, the ones who sing, shout, and protest, yet still share flags, the ones who march from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and who buy fruit and vegetables for their families. These are the people who held their military and government accountable for its overconfidence on Yom Kippur 50 years ago, and these are the people working to hold their government accountable today. It's these people who are at the top of the walls of our connectedness. They sit upon the foundations of our history, our shared identities and homeland, but it's these people, with their diversity and their imperfections, that complete the symbolic wall and our pictures of Israel. That's why we continue traveling to Israel. That's why we continue reciting the prayer for Israel, and that's why the Israeli bond pledge cards are still in the lobby outside. Because our connection to the one Jewish state is rooted in a strong foundation that spans several generations. And because we see more than just the stones, we see the hearts that beat inside of them. We are so grateful that Yom Kippur this year is not as dark as it was 50 years ago, but there is still darkness. On this Yom Kippur, Israel's fate hangs in the balance. What will become of its government and its people as these reforms and protests continue? There is tremendous work still to do, work that is important, and work that will have a major impact on the next 50 years for Israel and Jews around the world. But we ultimately know that the people of Israel, Am Yisrael, will forever be a people that we turn to with our hearts, saying and singing, Am Yisrael Chai. The people of Israel continue to live. Shana Tova.